Hi guys. So this lecture video is on slavery in antebellum America. At this time, it's also known as the peculiar institution. So we'll get into kind of the crux of what was going on during the time of slavery in America regarding this particular term. So our essential questions are: what role did King Cotton have on the institution of slavery? So how important was cotton in growing the economy during the South? And how it kept slavery continuing to expand and continue throughout the South in the United States. Second question is, why is slavery called the peculiar institution? Third question, ironically, who defended slavery the most and who opposed it? Fourth question, what events made Southerners more steadfast in their defense of slavery? And our last question that we need to consider with this lecture is, what gradients of abolitionism were there in the 1830s to 1860s? So there were different levels of abolitionism. Some strictly wanted to get rid of slavery altogether throughout the entire United States. And there were different levels of that depending on who you talk to. So that is also a question that we need to consider. So colonial slavery. So for number one, make sure you're filling in all the information for 1, 2, 3, and 4 that's missing. So just an overview of colonial slavery and the history is that in early American slavery, there were 10 million slaves brought to the New World after 1492. So remember we talked about Christopher Columbus and his son really kind of mainly his son influencing the start of the slave trade within North America. And it was the Spanish that started it first, as well as the Portuguese. And then, of course, the British really kind of took hold of that as well as they took hold of the Eastern United States. The French really didn't have a part in it necessarily. They had more friendly relationships with the Native Americans, as you can see. They were more open-minded, and they brought actually more explorers, and they were here for trade primarily. But they really didn't establish slavery in North America. And since they had control over Canada, and if you know anything about the history of slavery, most slaves, especially on the Underground Railroad, tried their best to get to Canada because that was free territory for slaves. So Canada, there was no slavery that existed in that in the northern half of North America. So only about 400,000 came to North America. Most of these came after the 1700s or during or after the year 1700. Only 7% of Southern colonies had slavery in 1670, and it was very costly. Slaves were subject to disease, and you really have to think of it in terms of thinking of slavery, at least at this point economically, as property. So if something happens to your property that is of high value, and they get sick and they die, that costs you quite a bit of money. So it's very costly to feed them, to clothe them, to house them, and then to make sure that they stay healthy. So for number 2, slavery boom, Bacon's Rebellion, and we talked about how Bacon's Rebellion brought on stricter regulations against slaves, and this really became kind of the turning point of hereditary slavery. So Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, Southern planters feared landless former servants. So a lot of these slaves were earning their freedom after a certain amount of time. They joined up with the people in Bacon's Rebellion and kind of destroyed this town in Virginia. And so people were really, really fearful that they would completely take over. So in terms of who's going to be a slave, it became way stricter, and they instituted hereditary slavery so that any child that's born whose mother was a slave would automatically become a slave. And then that continued for the next 200 or 300 years. So the Royal Africa Company lost its monopoly on the slave trade in 1698, and it started to expand greatly to other countries. And by 1750, slaves made up 50% of the Virginia population and outnumbered whites in South Carolina. So the slave population really started to increase after the year 1700. The Middle Passage, which I'm sure you guys have talked about in global history, because I know we covered it this year, or we will be covering it. And it dealt with most captured and sold slaves coming from West Africa. So what would happen is the slaves would be brought from West Africa to the Caribbean and North America. They were used to make or turn sugarcane into rum and finished product. That finished product in the Caribbean and North America would be shipped to Europe via England or other places in the coast, on the Atlantic coast in Europe, and then be sold there. And that money that was sold using those finished products would be used to buy more slaves. So they would go back to Africa. So again, kind of making that triangle as we know as the triangular trade. So they were sent on a grueling middle passage to North America into the New World and were sold at auction upon arrival. So again, families were split, children were often sold off, women were sold off primarily, especially if they could make more slaves, and they were high producers of more slaves, and then strong men were sold off as well. So families were split apart, unfortunately, and that's the unfortunate history about slavery. And it kind of disconnected them from not only their families, but from their culture in Africa. In terms of the status, there was a legal difference between slave and servant. It was kind of unclear originally, but in 1662, a law was passed in Virginia making slaves and chattel property for life. So once you were a slave after 1662, you were a slave for the rest of your life. So again, if you were a slave, you were a slave for the rest of your life, and there was a difference between a servant versus a slave. Just one second. So slavery started for economic reasons, but race ineffectively was used to perpetuate slaves and keep blacks subservient to whites. And they also used the Bible as well. And we'll talk about that with Nat Turner's Rebellion, how heavily the Bible was used as an instrument to make African slaves subservient to white masters, and using the Bible to legitimize that you should serve your master. This is what God intends you to do. All of that. But again, the economic reasons for slavery was the primary first thing because people were making money off of, again, getting and harvesting cash crops in order to keep their economy going. So you can take a moment and just make sure you fill in the information that's needed. All right, so with King Cotton, there was kind of this spirit of revolution. So it inspired many to emancipate slaves, and the future of slavery was really, really uncertain in the South. So again, as the cotton gin really became at the start, people were using to pick cotton by hand. It was very, very grueling work. It was backbreaking work. You worked long hours in the field. But the future of slavery was really, really uncertain until Eli Whitney came out with the cotton gin, which made separating the fibers from the seeds extremely, extremely easy. So 50 times more productive than picking cotton by hand. And because of the cotton gin, people were able to hire, or actually not hire, obviously, buy more slaves and be able to have them work at picking that cotton faster so that the cotton gin would allow it to be separated instead of having the slaves separated by hand. So all they need to do is pick it and have as many bundles as possible, and then the cotton gin would do its work by separating the cotton fibers from the seeds. And this caused slavery to explode throughout the South, and cotton became the main cash crop outside of tobacco or rice or indigo. So cotton accounted for 57% of all U.S. exports by 1860, and the South produced 75%. Again, 75% of the world's cotton supply came directly from the southern United States, especially to places in Great Britain, where they're now starting to have factories growing in terms of textile factories and using that cotton to create textile. Northern shippers benefited too because, again, they were making money shipping that cotton to Europe and back. So it wasn't just the South that benefited, it was also the North that benefited as well. All right, so looking at this map, you can see cotton production before around 1820. It wasn't as expansive as you might think in the early 19th century. So you see some primary areas where major production areas, of course, are South Carolina. But other areas in the South, at this time, it wasn't very, very expansive. So if we click the slide next one, you can kind of see by 40 years later, by 1860, which is during the Civil War, you can see that cotton is extremely expansive in certain parts and expands from South Carolina to parts of North Carolina. Extremely, extremely major production area in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, particularly along the Delta and the Mississippi River. Parts of Louisiana, Tennessee, and parts of Texas as well. So it comes from that, again, major production area from just in South Carolina to kind of expanding throughout the South. So in terms of distribution of slaves, again, looking at the comparison from 1820, um, Virginia had 50% or over, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and then a little small portion of Alabama and along the Mississippi River in Louisiana and Mississippi. You can kind of see that the percentage of total population by county of slaves is 50% in those areas, but everywhere else it's about 10 to 50%. So it was expansive and it really, really did increase, but with the increase of cotton, it exploded, as you can see in this next slide right here, 40 years later. So slavery becomes way more expansive, particularly as cotton expands as well. So the need for slaves to pick that cotton increases with the creation of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. All right, so the plantation system. So clearly, looking at the map of 1860, you can see that there are more slaves in the Deep South. The South was ruled by wealthy planter aristocracy, so there was no kind of middle class. You had a planter aristocracy that had a lot of money, and then you had the poor farmers who maybe had one or two slaves. And those planter aristocracies usually had even up most to, some would say, 200 plus slaves on their plantation. So it was like kind of a mini corporation within their own plantation. You had those workers, you had the overseers who you had to pay, you had the people in the house that would cook and clean, and then you had the family. And the overseers were the ones who monitored the work that the slaves were doing outside of the home and making sure that they were doing what they were supposed to do and would they would give out any type of punishment if a slave was not doing their job. So you had these very, very wealthy planter aristocracy, and then you had poor farmers who maybe had up to 5 slaves or not. Some didn't have slaves at all. And then a lot of the population was made up of slaves. So like we said, in South Carolina, most of the population was made up of slaves, and at least 50% in Virginia was made up of slaves. So by 1850 and 1700, or by 1850, 1,700 families owned more than 100 slaves. And I said some families had even more than 200. So there was a large gap between the rich and the poor. It was very hierarchical, almost a medieval social structure when you think of kind of the, not the feudalism system, but in terms of like, where the slaves were the workers on the land, they lived on the land, and then you had the lords in their estates. So again, very kind of reminiscent of Europe during the 1500s or early 1500s, before the Renaissance period. So land really is increasing in the hands of the few, instead of the more people who are lower class. So there was kind of some dangers of that plantation system. So slaves were very, very expensive. So again, like I mentioned before, you had to feed them, you had to clothe them, you had to house them. It was kind of a risky investment. Some might try to run off. And if you had to elicit or give some kind of punishment, that could inhibit them from doing their job. But it was a very risky investment. And slavery, of course, people don't want to be slaves. Most of them, unless they're conditioned to want to be slaves, if they're being sold at auction and their families being torn apart, they don't want to be in a position for the rest of their life as a slave. So it's a very risky investment. Dependence on one crop economy, mainly cotton. 4.4% were foreign-born compared to 18.7% in the North. And the South was very anti-immigrant. So again, as we were talking about in class, there was a first wave of immigrants and the second wave of immigrants. So as these new immigrants were moving into North America, and some were even coming to the South, a lot of those families in the South that had ties back to the 17 and 1600s were not very welcoming to immigrants. So you can see on the chart at the bottom that there were only 1,700 families that owned more than 100 or more slaves. A majority of people had only one each, or actually two to four or one. So about 105,683 owned two to four slaves. So the majority of the population had between one and four slaves. So again, that comprised of mainly those people who were poor farmers, or people who did not own specifically property, but they had land. Um, so again, you had a lot of people who were in a poorer position, and the upper class people who owned more slaves were a very small percentage of the population. All right, so white majority in the South, 25% of Southern families own slaves. So again, very few people own slaves. And again, a lot of those people in that 25% owned a majority of the economy or had a lot of money. 66% own less than 10 slaves each. So again, that's the largely poor or lower class people who are in the South. 75 of the South owned no slaves at all. So again, once again, a large percentage of those people in the South were poor, a very small percentage were rich. So those people fiercely defended the slavery system because, again, even though they didn't have slaves, they still benefited economically from the cotton that was being made. And again, this idea of superiority versus inferiority is really ingrained, particularly after 1662. This helped secure the place of white trash, quote unquote, in society as one step above the bottom. So the slaves, keeping them kind of subservient to them. And they really emphasized slavery because, again, they felt like they were still, even though they weren't rich and they didn't have slaves, they still were better than slaves. And they wanted to keep that one leg up in society. And if anything happened where slavery was to end, then they would be seen as equal to these people who they thought were less than dirt and not human. So again, you kind of have to think about the mentality of the people during that time. So they hope to own slaves one day and have that status symbol as, oh, I have this piece of property and this property is going to make me some money. But ending slavery, once again, would mean more competition for work because African Americans, once they were free, would have to try to find something to make money and have to work again and farm and do what they needed to do to earn money. So that created a sense of competition primarily for jobs and work. Mountain whites, particularly like in West Virginia, were completely detached from the slave system. They didn't really see a lot of slaves or have a lot of plantations in their areas, particularly among the Appalachian Mountains. And they hated the planters because they were rich, and would be fiercely loyal to the Union when the war breaks out. So those people within West Virginia and northern Tennessee along the Appalachian Mountains were just detached from that slavery system, even though they existed in the South. So they would become the ones that would be fiercely loyal to the Union during the Civil War. So plantation slavery, 4 million slaves in 1860 in the South. So this is 4 times more than what we started at the beginning of the 19th century. So as you can see, kind of looking back to those maps, how expansive it exploded just within 40 years from 1820 to 1860. Legal imports end in 1808. So remember, there was an agreement that was made that slavery or the slave trade would end by 1808. So that legal import of slaves ended in that year. But the increase is attributed to reproduction. So, obviously the women that were brought over were used to basically be breeders for more slaves. So again, it is due to natural reproduction, not importation of slaves. So it was very, very expensive to own a slave. Each slave approximately cost $1,800 by 1860, and therefore were spared some of the most dangerous work. So again, slave auctions still continued. It was the most cruel aspect of slavery. It was a threat of splitting families, was an effective tool to get slaves to do what they needed them to do. If you don't do what they need you to do, or they would say, if you don't do what I need you to do, your family's going to get split up and we're going to sell off your daughter. We're going to sell your husband. Or if you don't do this, we're going to split your family apart. So again, that was used as well to get slaves into submission to do what they needed them to do. So a lot of what was seen, Harriet Beecher Stowe actually visited a plantation in Kentucky and saw the horror of this slave auction and what life was like on a plantation, and decided to use her literary skills to speak out and protest against slavery. And this book became entitled as Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this talked about the horrors of slavery during that time in history. So African Americans started to develop a culture existing in the life that they were living. They were influenced greatly by the Second Great Awakening. These revivals that were going on started attracting more African Americans into Christianity, and a lot of them kind of were accepted into this church. It was heavily Christianized, but had a lot of African roots. So, like praise dancing kind of goes back to African dancing. All of that is kind of connected to their cultural background. Slave spirituals, so songs that were sung while they were working. Some of them had secret meanings, particularly during the Underground Railroad, but a lot of them really helped them to continue on and, again, develop ties to culture here in America, since their culture was cut off via the Middle Passage. Responsorial style of preaching, so again, the whole amen, praise dancing, was reflective of, again, African ring shout dance. So a lot of it has very African roots and cultural roots. And families stayed together as much as possible, as well as they could, given the situation that they were in. Conditions and treatment of slaves varied. So again, one of the famous things that most people bring up is the house slave versus the field slave, and how those working in the field were treated worse than those who worked in the house. But sometimes those who worked in the house were repeatedly being raped. So not necessarily better. You had, shelter. You had clothing, you worked for their master, but then again, you dealt with a lot of mental and even physical abuse as well, especially if you didn't adhere to what your master was telling you to do. If you worked in the field, it was backbreaking work. You still had the threat of being raped. Your family could be split apart, even probably more so. But again, they tried, and certain people will describe this as trying to pit different groups of blacks against other blacks. So oftentimes they would use lighter skinned African Americans to work in the house because they were looked at as prettier or have more beauty than darker skinned African Americans who worked in the field. And so again, this issue of colorism, the psychological thing that actually still exists in the African American community, became kind of ingrained in our culture. Again, lighter is prettier, darker is not as beautiful. But again, I think as we see in terms of modern day, more people of darker complexion being involved in a lot of our media and out there, that status of beauty is starting to change. But again, it's still ingrained in that culture, and primarily because of the history behind slavery. A lot of them were deprived of dignity, suffered cruel psychological and physical abuse. Rape often was happening very frequently, and a lot of them were denied education. So many of them couldn't read or write. Some of them who knew how to read or write had to sneak and teach other people to do it. And political rights were not there as well. And if you were one that knew how to read and write and were trying to teach others, it was a very, very dangerous situation. You could be lynched or killed for doing that. Some tried to escape through the Underground Railroad, or sabotage their master's system, and by not doing certain things or by sabotaging and doing something different than what they were told. But many of them were whipped. And if you were whipped and if you were scarred and if you had these injuries, or if your hand was cut off, or like Kunta Kinte, if your foot was cut off, your value as a slave went down increasingly, and you were harder to sell if you were needed to be sold. So your resale value went down significantly. But life in the South, in the Deep South, meaning Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Southern Georgia, was considerably worse than the Old South, say like North Carolina, Virginia, Northern South Carolina. So if you lived past and way down in the South, closer to the Gulf, your life was extremely and considered worse than the other or older areas of the South closer to Virginia. So revolts oftentimes did happen, but they were brutally crushed. One was Denmark Vesey in 1822, and one of the famous ones, which they recently had a film out, was Nat Turner's Rebellion. That happened in 1831. So Nat Turner was raised, he split from his family, raised with a white family, was taught to read the Bible, so he knew how to read. And he became a preacher as he got older. And what white plantation owners started to do, and his owners started to lend Nat Turner to these other plantation owners, preaching to the slaves that you need to be subservient to your master, you need to obey your master. One night, Nat Turner had this revelation that on, I think it was the next lunar eclipse, that they would try to revolt against their master and other masters in nearby plantations in the South. So when that happened, it lasted, I believe, for 2 days, where Nat Turner and his followers actually massacred his family. I think there was another plantation near that they massacred the family there, until soldiers actually put them down and cornered them. And then eventually Nat Turner was executed. And it was thought that they made souvenirs out of his skin, out of his bones, all of that. And the brutal reprisal in terms of the situation for slaves became even worse after that rebellion. And big slave owners became extremely, extremely strict as to any signs of rebellion. The nullification crisis in South Carolina also further entrenched Southern defense of states' rights to have slavery. So when we talked about South Carolina and the nullification crisis that existed by paying those tariffs, a lot of them were defending their right to have slaves. So again, after Nat Turner's rebellion, this wave of hysteria swept through the South. Slave codes were strengthened and instituted even harsher, and any type of emancipation or teaching slaves to read or write was made illegal. The gag resolution happened in 1836, which was an anti-slavery appeal, and petitions in Congress was prohibited. So anybody who tried to appeal to Congress to get rid of slavery, those types of petitions were prohibited in Congress. So they couldn't do those types of things. And they also began to defend slavery as a positive good. So like I said with Nat Turner, they started using the Bible to support slavery. And the civilization and Christianity saved Africans, made them civilized. Christianity civilized the slaves, and that they obey their master, they will get into heaven and they will be seen as good by God. So again, these relationships were like family. Unlike wage slaves of the North or people who were servants who made money, you're my slave, but you're also part of my family. And using that and being subservient to me and obeying me is like obeying God. So they really try to use the Bible to support what they were doing as well. So abolitionism in the South, in the North, or in the country as a whole, really started to increase. So what was abolition? Abolition was a movement in the North and South that demanded immediate end to slavery. Why was this happening? Well, it started with the Second Great Awakening. So as more African Americans were joining in Christianity and started developing their own culture within the church, the leaders like Theodore Weld and Lyman Beecher were one of the ones who led the Second Great Awakening, and they saw slavery as an evil. Great Britain freed slaves in the West Indies in 1833, so naturally the thought was that, well, if they're going to start freeing slaves and they're going to start banishing slavery, then America should try to follow suit. We're seeing it as kind of this evil that shouldn't exist. How and who were involved in abolitionism? So one of the first groups is called the American Colonization Society. They try to relocate African Americans to Liberia in 1822. So allowing African Americans, if you don't want to be here, you can go and travel back to Africa and establish yourself. And Liberia was actually established because of this. But the people who grew or created the American Colonial Society were actually white Americans, not African Americans. But it gave African Americans the opportunity to go back to Africa and establish their own country, which eventually they did in 1822 in Liberia. William Lloyd Garrison was another popular abolitionist. He wrote The Liberator, which was an abolitionist newspaper. He was extremely, extremely radical about his ideas of ending slavery. He even burned a copy of the Constitution on the 4th of July in 1854 as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Because again, you're saying that all men are created equal, but yet you're not treating all men equal, and you have certain men and humans that are slaves and others that are not, just based on the color of their skin. So this started the American Anti-Slavery Society. So there's a picture of William Lloyd Garrison, and then one of the famous drawings that they use is "Am I not a man and a brother?" So again, they should be viewed as equal was part of the philosophy that abolitionists had. Wendell Phillips was also a popular abolitionist. He refused to eat sugar or wear cotton, particularly because that's what was being harvested by slaves in the South. Um, and you would say, what's her name? Sorry, just give me 1 second. I'm blanking out. Totally blanking out. For D, it was. Ooh, totally blanking out. Let's go to E. Sojourner Truth was a free slave who spoke out for both women's rights and abolitionists. She attended Seneca Falls, and we talked about her in class. David Walker wrote The Appeal for the Colored Citizens of the World, calling for a bloody end to white supremacy. Frederick Douglass was a former slave and abolitionist. He wrote The North Star, which was an abolitionist newspaper. And political parties, the Liberty Party in 1840, Free Soil Party in 1848, and the Republican Party in 1850 supported the abolitionist movement. So I'm still trying to figure out who was in D, and I know some of you probably know. It was a woman. She also fought in the Civil War, and I'm blanking out. But we could actually talk about that in class. So I'll probably figure it out by the time we do our lecture next week. So I'm going to skip that one and come back to it. And then our last slide is on the peculiar institution. So abolitionists were hated by Southerners. They were disliked by Northerners, seen as too radical. The South owned the North money, and dissolve the Union would jeopardize a lot of what was actually happening. So we're getting kind of to this part where there's a lot of tension between Northern and Southern states. The South really wanted to keep the lifestyle and the economy that they had. The North was changing in a different direction. We were starting to manufacture our own products. Manufacturing was increasing. So we were starting to see, again, even more sectionalism. New England had textile mills, were dependent on the cotton of the South. So again, the South kind of helped the North make money too. Even though they were going in two separate directions, the North needed that cotton to create textiles, just like they were sending it overseas. So by 1850, though, abolitionist fervor had really taken root in North America, and it was starting to spread. So this idea of slavery, and it should it continue, became a forefront in American politics. So very few were prepared to abolish it outright, but many, including Abraham Lincoln, opposed extending it into the territories. So this is where we kind of go back to what we learned about with the Missouri Compromise. What happens when these new territories are being established? Are we going to continue allowing them to establish slavery, particularly below that 36-degree parallel line, or is something else going to happen? So again, a lot of this was becoming extremely, extremely political in the United States. All right, so again, if you want to go back to the last slide for number D, I still am blanking out. And I know who it is, but I'm blanking out because I know some of my kids are doing it for National History Day, but right now I'm just blanking out. I'll probably know it after this is over. But again, if you have questions, please make sure you write them down. We will get back to this lecture next week as we start talking about, again, Unchained Memories and the slave narratives, and we really get into slavery, and then we start talking about the Mexican-American War, which was one of the first national wars that dealt with kind of the issue of territory that we newly acquired and what we should do with it regarding slavery and all the new territories that we're expanding to as we kind of take on this idea of manifest destiny.